Today, we're taking a deep dive into Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. I think a lot of people have heard of this one. It's one of those books that really gets people thinking differently about their finances, and that's kind of what we want to do today. We're going to explore how our emotions and personal experiences can sometimes lead us to make, well, let's just say interesting financial choices, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Housel, he really kind of he challenges that idea that finance is just, all cold, hard logic.
Right.
He dives into the messy human side of money, which is something we can all relate to.
Exactly. And he kicks things off with this statement: it's not enough to know what to do with money. You need to understand how your mind works when trying to do it.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful, right? Like, we've come so far in fields like medicine because we've embraced scientific principles.
Right.
But with money, our emotions, they often hijack the whole process.
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of?
What's up?
That Voltaire quote, "History never repeats itself. Man always does."
Ooh.
It's funny how we see those same patterns playing out over and over again in the financial world, even though we know better, right?
Yeah.
Booms and busts, spending sprees followed by regret.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're programmed to make the same mistakes.
It's like that Groundhog Day,
Right? Exactly.
We're stuck in this loop. But speaking of those seemingly irrational choices, there's this chapter in the book called No One's Crazy.
Oh, yeah.
That really got me thinking. Housel argues that our financial decisions, no matter how head-scratching they might seem to others, actually make perfect sense to us at the time.
In the moment, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, think about someone who is struggling financially. They might buy a lottery ticket.
Right.
And on the surface, that seems so illogical.
Yeah. Right.
But when you consider their circumstances, the lack of access to, the things that build wealth, that opportunity for a life-changing win, it kind of starts to make sense from their perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about that context. And it's a reminder that we all come to the table with different experiences that shape our financial worldview. Imagine if Bill Gates hadn't had access to computers as a teenager. Would he be the same Bill Gates?
I don't think so.
No.
Probably not, right?
Probably not. And that highlights, luck and those unpredictable events in shaping financial outcomes. And I think for a lot of people, they don't have experience even with newer financial tools like index funds,
Right.
retirement accounts. They haven't seen it. Their families haven't used them.
Yeah.
So there's a natural hesitancy there.
Yeah, it's like we're wired to be a little risk-averse when it comes to the unknown.
Right.
And speaking of risk, Housel uses these contrasting stories of Jesse Livermore. This was like a legendary trader
Oh, yeah.
who made and lost fortunes, and Abraham Germansky, a real estate developer, wiped out by the '29 crash.
Yeah.
Both of these guys, they achieved great wealth,
Right.
but couldn't hold on to it. It's funny, because it's like that old saying, it's easier to make $1 million than to keep $1 million.
Right.
Livermore, he was so brilliant, like riding the market waves.
Yeah.
But he didn't have the discipline, to preserve that capital.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Germansky, he was just undone by an event completely outside of his control.
Right. So getting rich and staying rich.
Totally different games.
Two different games entirely. It makes you wonder, if someone like Livermore with all his talent and knowledge could lose it all,
Right.
what does that say about the challenges of maintaining wealth?
Yeah, it's tough. According to Housel, once you reach a certain level of financial security, the real test is not getting caught up in lifestyle creep
Right.
and overconfidence. Those are like the silent killers of wealth.
He tells a story about Rick Guerin, who was, the skilled investor, but unlike, the patient approach of Buffett and Munger, he was in a hurry. He wanted to get rich quick. He ended up over-leveraged. He had to sell his Berkshire Hathaway stock during a downturn for a fraction of what it was worth.
Ouch.
Ouch is right.
Yeah, that's a tough lesson about the importance of a margin of safety. Think of it like a financial buffer, right? It allows you to withstand those inevitable market shocks without losing everything.
Which brings to mind Warren Buffett's famous quote, "Rule number 1, never lose money. Rule number 2, never forget rule number 1.
Yeah, he's good at that.
Speaking of Buffett, he's a great example of how powerful compounding can be, especially over the long haul. Housel really pushes that it's not about chasing those sky-high returns, but about patience and letting those gains snowball over time.
Uses that amazing story of Ronald Reed, the janitor,
Uh-huh.
who amassed millions just by investing in blue-chip stocks over decades.
Yeah.
It's a testament to that slow and steady,
Yeah.
wins the race. Especially when you have time on your side. It's like those tiny shifts in the Earth's orbit that, trigger these massive ice ages over millennia.
Wow. Yeah.
Small changes compounded over time. It's remarkable.
Mind-blowing. Housel even compares Warren Buffett's wealth accumulated over 70 years to Jim Simons, this hedge fund manager, with much higher average annual returns,
Right.
but a shorter track record. And even with his exceptional skills, Simon's net worth is significantly lower because he's had less time to let compounding do its thing.
It's like the marathon runner versus the sprinter.
Right, exactly.
Marathon runner might be slower,
Right.
but ultimately covers more ground.
It's a powerful reminder that time is one of the most valuable assets we have when it comes to building wealth. And it ties into another crucial point that Housel makes: knowing when you have enough.
Oh, yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in that game of financial comparison, always looking over your shoulder. You know what I mean?
Always keeping up with the Joneses.
It's like that analogy he uses of the baseball player comparing himself to Mike Trout,
Right.
the best player in the game.
Yeah.
Then Trout compares himself to the top hedge fund manager, and on and on and on.
And it never ends.
It's an endless ladder.
You're never satisfied.
And it never leads to satisfaction. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does.
How much of our financial decision-making is driven by this almost primal need to keep up,
Absolutely. And it's something that Housel, he tackles that head on in the book. He talks about this idea of being reasonable over being strictly rational when it comes to money.
Yeah.
And to illustrate this point, he tells this fascinating story about Julius Wagner-Jauregg,
Okay.
a Nobel Prize-winning doctor who used fever therapy to treat syphilis.
Wait, fever therapy.
I know it sounds kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
But back in the early 1900s, before penicillin and all, he observed that syphilis patients who developed high fevers, they actually showed improvement. So he started experimenting with inducing fevers in his patients.
Oh, wow.
And while it was risky,
Yeah.
it proved somewhat effective.
Wow.
He even won a Nobel Prize for it.
Wow. Talk about a bold move. But how does this connect to, personal finance?
Well, the takeaway is that sometimes what seems irrational on the surface
Yeah.
can be perfectly reasonable when you consider the bigger picture. In the case of this fever therapy, the short-term discomfort
Right.
was outweighed by the potential long-term benefit.
So it's like choosing a path that's maybe a little bit uncomfortable.
Right, exactly.
But ultimately better.
Exactly. And you can apply that same thinking to investing. For example, holding a lot of cash during a bull market.
Yeah.
Might seem irrational to some people because you're missing out on gains.
Right.
You're leaving money on the table.
Right.
But if that cash cushion helps you avoid panic selling during a downturn
Yeah.
and allows you to stay invested, through the ups and downs,
Yeah.
it becomes a reasonable choice.
Right.
Even if it doesn't, perfectly maximize your returns in the short term.
Yeah. It's about finding that balance between logic and emotional comfort, right?
Exactly.
Making sure you can sleep at night, knowing your, financial strategy is aligned with your risk tolerance.
Precisely. And, it's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Housel even suggests that sometimes, sticking with individual stocks, even though, diversification is generally recommended, can be reasonable.
Okay.
If it keeps you engaged and excited about investing.
So a little bit of irrationality can be healthy.
Right.
As long as it doesn't completely derail your overall financial plan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about finding what motivates you and keeps you committed to those goals for the long haul. But let's not forget about the unexpected.
Right.
Those curveballs.
Right.
Housel dedicates a whole chapter to this idea of preparing for surprises.
Oh, yeah. And that's something that we don't often think about when planning, right?
Right.
Our finances.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of assuming the future will look just like the past.
Right. Exactly.
Right. We tend to rely heavily on historical data
Yeah.
when making financial decisions.
Yeah.
But Housel reminds us that the truly impactful events, those are often the ones that we couldn't have predicted.
The ones that come out of left field. It's that classic line, things that have never happened before happen all the time.
Exactly. And to drive that point home, Housel dives into all sorts of unpredictable historical events. Hitler's birth, the invention of the airplane, the dot-com bubble.
Right.
These were all events that completely reshaped the world. but none of them were easily predictable based on, what had happened before.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to be prepared for those unforeseen circumstances,
Right.
even if we can't anticipate exactly what they'll be.
And that leads us to another fascinating concept Housel explores: the power of narratives in shaping our economic reality.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So he uses the 2008 financial crisis as an example. While the economy's underlying capacity for production remained largely intact, it was fear and pessimism, that dominant narrative at the time, that led to such a devastating downturn.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
People were so convinced things were going to be bad that they actually became bad.
Exactly. And the same thing can happen in reverse. Positive narratives can drive booms and bubbles like we saw with the dot-com frenzy.
Right.
Our perceptions and beliefs, even if they're not rooted in, objective reality, can have a profound impact on the economy.
It's amazing how our collective mindset can influence, the financial world.
It really is. And speaking of navigating that complex world,
Yeah.
Housel offers one final piece of advice that I think is particularly insightful.
Yeah.
Financial advice is personal.
Yeah. Tell me more.
He argues that we need to identify our own individual goals, our own time horizons, and not be swayed by others who might be playing a different game.
Right.
He shares his personal approach, which is centered on long-term passive investing, and encourages readers to define their own game, based on their unique circumstances and risk tolerance.
That's such a great point, because we all have different financial personalities,
Right.
different priorities, different comfort levels with risk. What works for one person
Totally.
might be a disaster for another.
Absolutely. And that's where the true power of understanding, the psychology of money
Right.
comes in.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that there's no single right answer. And the most important thing is finding a strategy that aligns with your individual values, goals, and, temperament.
It's about self-awareness, understanding your own biases, and making decisions that feel right for you, even if they don't always align with, conventional wisdom.
You got it.
Yeah, it's almost like you're creating your own financial fingerprint.
Yeah, exactly.
What makes you tick? What motivates you? What keeps you grounded?
And that self-awareness is so key to making choices that aren't just smart on paper, but also feel right in your gut. It's about aligning your financial strategy with your values and, that long-term vision.
Yeah, Housel talks about the danger of assuming the future is going to be a straight line from the past.
Right.
Which is, such an easy trap to fall into.
Oh, totally. He uses this analogy about a time traveler from 1950,
Oh, yeah?
suddenly waking up in today's world.
Right.
Imagine their shock.
I know.
Technology, globalization, social norms, it's all changed so drastically. Yet we often base our financial decisions on the assumption that, tomorrow is going to look pretty much like yesterday.
It's like we forget that the world is constantly evolving, right?
Right.
Throwing those unexpected curveballs.
And those unexpected events, the ones we couldn't have predicted, often have the biggest impact on our lives,
Right.
including our financial lives. Think about the rise of the internet,
Yeah.
or the fall of the Soviet Union,
Right.
or even events like 9/11. No one saw those coming,
Right.
but they fundamentally reshaped the global landscape.
It's a humbling reminder that, we don't have a crystal ball.
Right.
We can't predict the future with certainty, which is why it's so important to build in flexibility, I guess.
That ties back into the margin to safety, right? That financial cushion
Right.
to absorb those unexpected shocks. But there's another layer to this.
Okay.
Understanding the power of narratives. Housel argues that we're all influenced by these stories, both positive and negative,
Right.
that shape our perceptions of risk and opportunity.
So it's not just about the numbers,
Oh,
it's the stories we tell ourselves and that we hear from others.
Exactly. He points out that pessimism, while often presented as more intellectually rigorous,
Right.
can be just as misleading as blind optimism.
Okay.
Both extremes can cloud our judgment and lead us to make decisions that aren't truly in our best interest.
Yeah, I remember him telling that story about the Russian professor back in 2008 who predicted the imminent collapse of the United States.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And obviously, it didn't happen. But his prediction gained a lot of traction because it played into those fears and anxieties at the time.
It's a perfect example of how a compelling narrative, even if it's based on shaky assumptions,
Right.
can take hold and influence behavior. It's a reminder to be critical of the information we consume.
All that we've learned from the psychology of money and boil it down to a few key takeaways, what would those be?
Well, one of the most powerful messages is that financial success, it's not just about the numbers. It's about understanding ourselves, our biases, our emotions, our motivations.
Yeah.
It's about balancing the rationale with the reasonable.
Making choices that fit with our values and our long-term goals.
Right. Exactly. Housel wraps up the book with a few suggestions, but the one that sticks with me is this. Be humble, be kind, and be patient.
Those are good words to live by for everything, really.
I think so. Humility helps us remember that we don't know everything, and we're always learning. Kindness helps us make choices that benefit everybody, not just ourselves.
Right.
And patience, well, patience lets us stay focused on the long term and helps us get through those rough patches without giving up.
It all comes back to that long game mindset.
Exactly.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the psychology of money. We hope you enjoyed it and keep exploring the world of personal finance. It's fascinating. We'll see you next time.